So Barrett
Wow.
says, so clearly, they found Oswald's wallet at the Tippit scene. It's a slam dunk. He obviously killed the cop.
Quorum radio, baby.
The police rushed to the scene. Of course, the police officer had been shot, which, nowadays, police are shot all the time. But in 1963, that was a very rare occurrence. In fact, if you go back and look, the police officer shot prior to Tippit was 7 years before that, and after him was another, I think, 10 years.
Wow.
But long periods of
shooting.
time. Without a shooting of a police officer.
Amazing.
And a lot of the cops thought the shooting was connected, but some people weren't sure. When I say some people, reporters and so forth that were going to the scene weren't sure, is this connected to this assassination attempt, But they thought, well, we better cover it anyway, something's going on.
Yeah.
A lot of the police thought, well, it's got to be connected, I mean, it's such an unusual situation. And Tippit is shot like 2.5 miles and 45 minutes after the presidential assassination attempt. So a guy on foot could have walked that distance, could have walked 2.5 miles in 45 minutes. So it's certainly within the area of a possibility of it being connected.
Sure.
So
And
anyway,
by the way,
police.
Sure. Let me just have a quick question, Dale. Oswald at the scene of the crime of J.D. Tippit being killed, did he leave any evidence or anything at all at the scene of the crime? Bullets, shell casings, or?
Yeah. He had a .38 caliber revolver when he was arrested, and the revolver used .38 special shells. And Oswald was seen unloading the gun at the corner house, 2 houses from where he'd shot the officer, unloading the shells, and they did find 4 shells in that immediate area, in the bushes and along the side of the house. Those shells were later proven to have been fired in the revolver that he had in his hand at the Texas Theater when he was arrested, to the exclusion of all other weapons on the planet. So there's absolutely no question that the revolver that Oswald had in his hand, that he pulled on police officers attempting to arrest him at the Texas Theater, was the weapon that was used to murder J.D. Tippit.
Right. And so, and by the way, were they able to pull any? And I want to also ask you about the whole wallet issue. Were there any prints that they could pull off of the car, off of the shell casings, anything at all that connected Harvey Oswald?
Well, they attempted to they dusted the car for prints, because Helen Markham said that he might have, she saw him lean down, he might have put his arms or his hands on the car. And in those early moments, you're not sure, so you just do it. So they dusted the side of the car. The police later said the prints were of no value. I took it upon myself to get a high-quality photograph of those prints that were taken, which were in the police files, and I put them in front of a Michigan State Police fingerprint expert prior to my book coming out, because I wanted to find out, were these really of no value? The one set of the prints looked kind of clear. I thought maybe the cops overlooked something. So, but I put it in front of him, and he checked it against the fingerprints they took from Oswald, and determined that the prints were the legible print he was able to look at was not that of Oswald. And I said, well, what does that mean? He says, it doesn't mean anything. He asked me, was the car ever secured? I said, no. Police didn't get there for a few minutes, and there were people using the police radio, and we know they took Tippit's gun and put it on the hood of the car and then moved it to the seat. I said, and he
how
says,
many bystanders, how many bystanders do you think were there at the scene of the crime with J.D. Tippit?
By the time police got there, not that many, but probably 7 or 8, 7 to 10, something like that, somewhere in that neighborhood. I mean,
and then how many cops?
How many cops?
Law enforcement? How many cops and detectives and others that showed up at the scene of the Tippit?
25 to 30 easily.
Wow.
25 to 30 that are on the police radio, and there were quite a few that didn't even use the radio, just went out there. So there's quite a few people. The bottom line is Herb Lutz, who was the fingerprint expert that I got to do this analysis, said, well, it doesn't mean anything. He says the garage mechanic could have touched the side of the car earlier that morning before the car went out. He said it could have been anybody. So the fact that it wasn't Oswald's didn't mean it. If they'd have found Oswald's prints on there, okay, then it would have put him at the scene. But the fact that they didn't find Oswald's prints didn't mean that he wasn't there, right? You'd have to turn to some
Sure,
to
of course.
other evidence.
That's not, that's not here nor there. Let me ask you a question. Was Oswald's wallet found or anything like that? Did that happen also, or is that not true?
You know, it's a long story. I go into it in my book. It's actually a whole chapter. The short of it is that in 1996, James Hosty, the FBI agent who was in charge of the Oswald file, told a story that he got from a fellow agent, a guy by the name of Bob Barrett. And Bob Barrett had been out at the Tippit shooting scene, but he had told Hosty over dinner, years before, that while he was at the scene, Captain Westbrook was there, and he had a wallet in his hand, and he asked about some IDs in there, and he said, "Do you know Lee Oswald? Do you know Alec Heidel?" And Barrett told Hosty, "It didn't mean anything to me at that time. I just said no," and that was that. He says, and then of course later we find out the rifle is traced to Oswald, and he ordered it under the assumed name of Heidel. So Barrett says, so clearly, they found Oswald's wallet at the Tippit scene. It's a slam dunk. He obviously killed the cop. Now, what Barrett didn't know is that two things. He didn't know that Oswald's wallet was actually taken out of his pocket after his arrest in the patrol car on the way back to City Hall. And secondly, he didn't know that there was a film that was shot by a television crew, a local television crew, that shows police at the Tippit shooting scene, and in one of the shots, they show police handling a wallet. Now, I knew about the footage, and when I read the story, I thought, there might be film evidence supporting Barrett's story. And I thought, well, this will show that Oswald dropped his wallet at the scene. Maybe he was handing it to Tippit, or who knows, but here's a wallet. So I called Bob Barrett, and I worked with him for several months, and we tried to find corroborating evidence that supported the story. Well, the first thing I did was I arranged with the National Archives to get Oswald's wallet out of cold storage and photograph it at the same angles that it was filmed. This wallet on the film shows up. And I was able to determine that although the wallets were similar, it clearly wasn't the same wallet. And I went and talked to Paul Bentley, who took the wallet off Oswald in the arrest, after the arrest in the car, and I told him the story. He said, "Oh, it didn't happen, Dale. I'm telling you, I took the wallet out of So I traced the whole pedigree of Oswald's wallet, and I call it the arrest wallet, the wallet that came out of his pocket after his arrest.
Sure.
And then I tried to track down, well, where did this wallet at the scene come from? And basically, it kind of shows up, and somebody turned it in to police at the scene while they were looking for evidence. So
the second wallet,
it looks like somebody found it somewhere, and and I went back. It wasn't around the car, so wherever they found it, it was somewhere close enough, I guess, that somebody thought it might be connected, but it wasn't in the immediate area of the shooting.
Right,
and then of course
that particular, one second, just to clarify. So that particular wallet found near the scene of the crime was that had the A. Heidel documents in it, right? That's what.
No, it didn't. No, see, this is the whole point. The point is that once I realized, well, the wallet with the IDs, the Heidel IDs and Oswald's ID, that's in Oswald's pocket at his arrest.
Okay, right, okay.
Okay, so then it gets down to, all right, so what's the evidence that the IDs are in this wallet that's at the scene? Well, the only evidence is Bob Barrett's 30-year-old recollection that those questions were asked of him by Captain Westbrook while he was at the scene. So then I worked with Bob, and we went over. He said, I thought I put it in a report. So I found his 302 report. It's not in there. I talked to a fellow agent of his who said that Bob was known for putting all kinds of details in his reports that other agents wouldn't.
Meticulous.
Things that weren't necessary to the story, but yet here was this a key element now that he didn't include.
Yeah.
And then he said, well, maybe I testified to it in 75. No, he didn't either. So there was no contemporary record. Then I did find out that Barrett did go back. He went to the Texas Theater. He was there for the arrest. After they took Oswald back to City Hall, he went back with Captain Westbrook to City Hall. And at that time, Captain Westbrook did see the wallet, and Bob Barrett was there. And so I asked Bob, I says, is it possible that the questions, in fact, weren't asked of you at the scene, but were asked back at City Hall when we know the wallet with the ID is actually there and Westbrook has it? In other words, I thought, maybe Bob's just messing up, the recollection.
Yeah. Sure.
And, as you know, and as anybody who's told a story, I go back to a story. I used to tell a story about when I was a kid. In the summer, we'd go out to my grandparents' cottage. And for years, I told this one story. And then one day, like 30 years later, one of my cousins who was there said, "That's not what happened." And she started to tell me, well, here's what happened. And as she was saying it, Bill, I realized, oh, my God, she's right. I now remember, yeah, that's what happened. I've been telling it wrong for 30 years.
Sure.
And I was convinced in my own mind that I was right. So I think, to be honest, Bob was a great guy. We worked very close with this. He had an opportunity to read the manuscript of the book before it was published, so he had a chance to change it and add any corrections. And I had to, of course, he wasn't happy that the way I came down on it. I basically said, I think he's mistaken, because I think the evidence, that's what it shows. There's no other conclusion you can come to.
Right. So what do you think?
And of course, I knew, I'm sorry.
No, I want to quickly ask you. So the thing is, was there in fact a wallet found nearby, or do you think maybe that was misremembering?
Well, there's a wallet on film. There's absolutely no question there's a wallet on film. But the wallet on film is not the wallet that was taken from Oswald after his arrest. So there's a second wallet. There's another wallet. Now, the conspiracy folks have had a high old time with this ever since 1998 when I published this story. And all the stuff that you read online, every single bit of it stems from my book, from the work that I did originally on that story. And of course, it cheeses me off to no end that it's been twisted and bastardized to the point where I don't even recognize it anymore. But of course, and here's the thing, Bill, while I was working on that, I was working with a friend, and I said, the conspiracy folks are going to have a field day with this. So we immediately started to think, okay, so what are they going to say? And we thought, well, they're going to say it's a plant, of course. So we're thinking like conspiracy theory. All right, so it's now. So how do we prove that it is or is not a plant? So I went at it with that idea. Let's find the truth about this. If we can knock down this, or maybe we'll find out it is a plant. I didn't know. I knew it was an interesting part of the story. But here's the one thing that's interesting is Bob Barrett thought that the wallet was Oswald's and proved that he killed Tippit. So on one hand, they would now want to champion, Bob Barrett was right. He did see the wallet, but they want to ignore the fact of what he thinks that meant. And they want to instead say, well, but he was right about seeing it, but it was really a plant. Sure. And the bottom line is nobody knows the pedigree of that wallet. I thought it might have been a witness's wallet, or for a while people thought it was Tippit's wallet, but that was all eliminated.
Right, but nobody. One question though, Dale, was that so nobody actually saw? Did somebody actually testify that they saw a wallet fall out of Oswald's pocket near the scene of the crime as he fled?
No, and all the radio and television guys who were there never reported it. Can you imagine if they had Ron Ryland was filming it. Now he said, this is the police officer's wallet, and the officer also had Tippit's service revolver, and he kind of got him flipped around. He said, well, it's the gun it was the suspect's gun in the police officer's wallet. Well, it was actually the police officer's revolver, which got me to thinking, well, maybe it's the suspect's wallet then, right?
Sure.
The reverse.
Sure.
But here's the thing. If they'd have found Oswald's wallet at the Tippit scene, that would have been all over television and radio that night. That would have been all over. And the cops would have loved it. Can you imagine? We found the suspect's wallet right there at the scene. It'd be a done deal. But yet there's not a single report, Bill, not a single radio or television report. And so that begs the question, well, then apparently it had nothing to do with it. Somebody turned a wallet in.
Had anybody ever reported there was something inside of it?
Well, no, we have nothing. Now the story came out later. Kenneth Croy was a reserve police officer, and he later stated that an unknown person gave him the wallet, and also the pistol was turned over to him. Now we know Tippit's pistol was actually commandeered by Ted Calloway, an eyewitness, and he grabbed a local cabbie and then went driving around looking for for Oswald. They were going to throw down on him and do a citizen's arrest. And
that
I know
was another time. I mean, let me tell you, it was another time.
Yeah. Well,
This
Ted
was the-
Calloway he was a Marine. He was I was going to say a former Marine, but there's no such thing as a former Marine.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
He was a Marine in World War II. He fought at Iwo Jima, the Marshall Islands. I
Wow.
talked to him, and he was still the same when he was in his 80s. He said, Dale, picking up that gun off the ground was like picking up a stick to me. It didn't mean anything. He said, I grabbed it and I tried to get that cabbie to find him. And I said, well, what would have happened if you'd have found Oswald? He says, I'd have thrown down on him. And I says, well, what if he wouldn't have cooperated? He says, I'd have shot him. And I believe he would have. But as it turned out, he ends up, the police caught up with them driving around and said, they took the guns. You got to go back to the scene. So they end up coming back to the scene with the pistol. So somewhere along the way, this wallet is turned in. And of course, we know there were some shells found by Domingo Benavides. And then later the Davis girls found some shells and so forth. So people were scouring the area, picking up anything that was laying around. And somebody might have picked up a wallet and turned it in. It might have had nothing to do with anything.
Sure.
So the bottom line is there's no wallet in that. There's no second wallet in evidence,
Wow.
And there's no pedigree to the wallet. Interestingly, when I finally talked to Kenneth Croy before his death, and I asked him about the wallet, and he says, well, there were 7 IDs in it, but none of them were Oswald or Heidel. And I said 7 IDs, and I said, so now I'm thinking, well, the guy's either misremembering or he's just flat out making this up. And I said, well, no, wait a minute. If there were no IDs to Oswald, you're the one that, the conspiracy folks are saying you're the guy who believes that this was Oswald's wallet left at the scene. How did you connect the wallet to Oswald if his ID's not in it? He said, well, I just assumed it was his because whoever gave it to him said the suspect might have dropped this. And because the suspect later turned out to be Oswald, he said, I just assumed it was Oswald's wallet. Yeah, so that's how things can get twisted and assumed and so forth. Especially and then as Bob Barrett, of course, said, he never saw the wallet. He never saw the ID,
Sure. Great. And so the question I wanted to backtrack to, first of all, there were no prints at all on the shell casings at all?
I don't know that they even dusted the shell casings. I've seen this more recently where why didn't they dust the shell casings? He was seen. 2 eyewitnesses saw him removing the shells from the revolver with the cylinder open and dropping him, and then they're later found right there where they saw him doing that. I don't know why you would need his fingerprints on him to prove that he handled them. It doesn't make any sense. And my understanding is shells can or cannot, or sometimes don't, contain fingerprints. It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, sure. Now, how many blocks away or how far away was Oswald's rooming house from where J.D. Tippit got murdered?
It was 9/10 of a mile.
So I've seen people make a big deal about that. I
know, but anybody who's been down there and has walked it knows you can walk it. You can walk it in about 12 to 13 minutes, and we don't know that Oswald didn't flat out run. Nobody knows the direct route that he took, but it can be done in about 12 minutes. And I've heard people say, well, the time would have been really tight. It's like, well, yeah, he didn't just show up and now he's standing around waiting to shoot a cop. I mean, of course the time is tight. It's going to be the exact amount of time to get there, and then the shooting happens. I mean,
Sure. And by the way, there's a point, excuse me, Del, where Oswald was walking, is aware that J.D. Tippit's that a police car is approaching him. What happened? Didn't he change direction?
Well, that was my speculation. I'm the first one, as far as I know, that came up with this. And it was all because in reading the eyewitness testimony, prior to my book, Mark Lane and others, would say, speculated that, look, there's these eyewitnesses that say he's walking west. And the Warren Commission said he was walking east. If he's walking west, he'd have to have gone someplace beyond where the shooting occurred and then be coming back. The time would be, so outrageously long that there's no way he could have been killed. That it should exonerate him automatically. Right. So they would point out, here's all the witnesses that said he was walking west. Then, of course, the Warren Commission is saying, no, here's the witnesses that say he was walking east. So in looking at the two, it occurred to me one day, I thought, well, what if they're both right?
Yeah, sure.
And so I started looking. I noticed that the witnesses that said he was walking east, which were Helen Markham and Bill Scoggins, who's the cabbie sitting on the corner, neither of them looked toward the police car that's pulling over to the curb until the event starts to happen. In other words, they didn't even look over and notice Oswald until the police car is pulling over. That's what Helen Markham initially said. Now, later she changed her story and that she saw him earlier and so forth. But the initial story is the car, the police car, is what attracted both their attention. And as they followed it over the street, they see it slowing down, and then they see a guy walking the same direction as the car, which is east. But you had, 3 or 4 witnesses earlier that said, no, he was walking west. He was coming from the other direction. And so it occurred to me, well, what if they're both right? What if Oswald is walking west? And I figured out where he would have to be when he spots Tippett's patrol car, and then what distance, if he switched direction right there and ends up getting pulled over, 3 doors down, where would he have been when he switched direction? And I figured out it would have been just before he got to the last house. So Scoggins wouldn't have seen him. Helen Markham wouldn't have noticed him, and it would have only been he would have switched direction, saw Tippett's approaching patrol car. And that seemed to make some sense to me for a couple of reasons.
Yeah, sure.
First off, Oswald has been away from the book depository for 45 minutes. Unlike everybody else, he's not listening to the radio or watching TV. He has no idea what's going on. He doesn't know if someone saw him in the window. He doesn't know if his employees have already turned in his name and said he's missing. The police could be out looking for him. See, he doesn't know any of this. So when he sees the patrol car coming, it's what you call consciousness of guilt. His actions betray that he is afraid of something. So he turns and changes direction. And while a lot of people, initially the Warren Commission said that Tippit stopped Oswald because he fit this meager description. And of course, Mark Lane and a lot of others jumped on that saying, oh, come on. The description was so vague, Tippit would have to be stopping everybody in Dallas practically.
But what kind of reaction? There's some speculation that I think the rhetorical questions that maybe need to be asked that are fair, and that is that when Oswald spoke to Tippit, did he give a sarcastic response? Was he asked a question? Did Oswald act just like a normal person, or did he act kind of have a reaction that was a little bit suspicious? Why would he leave the car?
Actually, that occurred to me, and I talked to Murray Jackson. He told me an interesting story that ties into exactly what you're talking about. So back when Murray and JD were partners, early 60s, Murray said he was driving down, it turned out to be Beckley, as a matter of fact, in Oak Cliff. JD's in the passenger's side, and he says, as we're driving down Beckley and we pass this one residential house, a brick house on the corner, JD says, hey, pull over at the next side street. And Murray didn't know what he had seen or what had happened. He pulls around the corner. He says, JD jumps out of the car and goes up to the porch, and there's a kid up on the porch of the first house there. And by the time Murray said I parked the car and then I joined him, he says, JD's already up there talking to the kid, and they ended up arresting the kid. He had a gun on him. And JD later told him, I saw the guy make this overt move, kind of ducked his hand behind his back or something. And that's cop spot stuff like that, right? So I think that the about face is what caused Tippit to initially pull over. All right. Now, I don't think anybody else believes, based on what happened, that Tippit suspected that Oswald was the presidential assassin. I think he just saw something suspicious. He pulls the car over. Now, here's an interesting thing that occurred to me. Oswald had to have double time to get over there. So to cover 9/10 of a mile in 12 minutes, he'd have to be practically running or certainly briskly walking. Now,
let me interject something here. One quick thing. Look, Oswald at the time of the shooting was, let's see, who was what, 24?
Yeah.
Former Marine. My son was a Marine. And preparing him to be a Marine meant a tremendous amount of running, a lot of stuff. So a lot of physicality at that time as well. I mean, we're talking about a guy who's probably in pretty good shape. I don't know if he kept in good shape or not. He wasn't somebody who was overweight, apparently, at least according to the photos. What's the big deal? I mean, for him to make a 9/10 of a mile You know, we're not
No,
talking about a guy in the 60s.
no. I agree. He certainly could make the distance. My point is that he still had the zipper jacket on, and it was 68 degrees out, which means that he probably was sweating. So when he leans over in the car, you know, maybe his hair is wet, he looks sweaty, and I'm thinking that maybe Tippit sees that and thinks, that's odd. Why wouldn't you just take off your jacket, right? I mean, if you're so hot, you're sweating, why wouldn't you just take off the jacket and carry it over your arm? Why has he got the zipper jacket on? And so I'm thinking maybe something like that, or something that Oswald said, sarcastic or something, perhaps, because it was a 10-second conversation. I think Tippit gets out simply to investigate further. And we know that Domingo Benavides was approaching. There was some traffic coming, and I think Tippit was distracted to get out around the driver's door, get it closed behind him, and then kind of skirt along the side of the car there, you know, so he doesn't get hit by the oncoming traffic. And I think just those couple of moments, he's not looking at what Oswald's doing, and of course Oswald's pulling the pistol. So JD did pull his pistol out. It was underneath his body. No shots were fired, but I think he was probably drawing the gun more as a reflex action.
Sure. How consistent were the descriptions of the suspect, the person seen that shot JD Tippit, and the man found in the Texas State, Lee Harvey Oswald? How similar? Was it identical? Were there any discrepancies?
No, they were pretty. It was close enough. I mean, you know, some people were all over the map on the jacket. Some people said it was brown. No, it was light tan. No, it was gray. No, it was white. You know, some said he had a light-colored shirt and dark slacks, or the reverse. You know. So, but in terms of the eyewitnesses, we know Ted Calloway picked, and he's the used car manager that absconded with Tippit's revolver and chased after Oswald. But when Oswald was fleeing, he was less than a block from the scene, and he's got the gun in a raised pistol position. And Calloway's, you know, he doesn't know if he's a detective or what. He just yells, "Hey, man, what the hell's going on?" And Oswald kind of stopped and shrugged his shoulders and said something Calloway couldn't understand. And then Oswald kind of realizes, I'm drawing attention to myself. So he's kind of briskly walking instead of running, and he's trying to jam that gun into his belt. Well, Calloway observed Oswald pass him about, you know, the width of the road, so 56 feet or so. I think they measured it later. And that night, Calloway goes down, before he saw Oswald on television, goes down and picks him out of a lineup. Absolutely, positively, that's the guy I saw fleeing from the scene. And I'll tell you what, out of all the witnesses I talked to, Ted Calloway was rock solid. I talked to him several times over a 15-year period. He never really varied the story, other than a couple of minor details or things. You know, he was in his 80s when he died, that you would expect over time. But as far as his identification of Oswald and what happened, he never really varied from the story. I thought he was a supremely good witness. I would have convicted Oswald on his testimony alone, although, you know, you want physical evidence, of course, and there was. But just in terms of eyewitnesses, if he was the only eyewitness, it would have been a done deal. And so here's the interesting thing, Bill. There was something like 11 eyewitnesses that either saw the shooting or saw him fleeing the scene. And we know that each one of those people pick up the suspect as he's running. So Calloway sees him run until he gets to the corner, and then you got somebody else. So, I saw him from that corner to the next corner, and so on. So the thing is, you know, a lot of conspiracy folks have tried to shoot down each eyewitness. But the bottom line is, we know they're all seeing the same person. It's not like, you know, a guy materializes and then disappears and he's replaced by a completely different individual. So if any of those 11 along that route are positive that that's the guy, well, then they all saw the same guy.
Right. So, and let me,
and I think Calloway was solid on that. So,
Dale, what was the distance between the scene of the Officer J.D. Tippit shooting and the shoe store in the Texas Theater?
That's about 6 blocks. So it took Oswald about 20 minutes to go the 6 blocks. And I've heard people say, well, no, wait a minute. It only took him 12 minutes to walk 9/10 of a mile, but then it took him 20 minutes to go 6 blocks. It's like, well, first off, you got, you know, a lot of police cars pouring into the area. So you're not just strolling down the street now. You're slinking from one garbage can to the next, and you're trying to get your way down there. So it makes sense that it would have taken him longer to get there. But he got down to Hardy's shoe store, and as the story goes, people familiar with this story, there's a shoe store manager, Johnny Brewer. He's about 20, and he sees Oswald step into the vestibule, and it's very clear that Oswald's feigning like he's looking at the merchandise because his police sirens are ripping behind him. He kept looking over his shoulder, and the shirt's out because he had ditched the jacket that he was wearing. The shirt's out, the shirt tail's out, and Oswald looks suspicious. And then when he leaves the vestibule and heads up toward the Texas Theater, Brewer steps out on the sidewalk, and he looks up, and the theater's another 100 feet or so up the street. And Johnny Brewer can see Julia Postal, the ticket taker, come out of her booth, and she's standing, and they're both looking west up Jefferson Boulevard, and Oswald's in between them. And so Brewer sees Oswald slip into the theater behind Julia's back. So he walks up the street. He says, "Hey, did that guy buy a ticket?" And she kind of half expected to see him because out of the corner of her eye, she remembers somebody approaching from that direction. And then she realizes, well, he never passed her, and he could have only gone in the theater. And so she said, well, no, he didn't buy a ticket. So Brewer went in and checked to make sure that he hadn't slipped out one of the exits. And when he was confident that he was still in there, he came back out and told her, better call the police. That might be who they're looking for. Now, by that time, he had heard, of course, on the radio that the president had been shot. And I think they had just announced that it was dead. And then Brewer also said that he had heard a report that there was a shooting of a police officer in Oak Cliff, although they didn't specify where it was. So he just thought, well, maybe it's something to do with this whole thing. And that was at 1:45 when the report went out over the radio of a suspect hiding in the Texas Theater. The cops poured in the front, they poured in the back. Johnny Brewer was up by the stage. He was, they have the exit curtain on either side of the stage. He's kind of standing behind that exit curtain. And when the cops came in the front door, they were yelling to turn up the house lights. The movie's still rolling, but they brought the house lights up a little bit. And when they did, Brewer spotted Oswald in the fifth seat, third row from the back, fifth seat in from the aisle. Saw Oswald stand up, start to exit, go to the aisle to exit. Apparently saw the police pouring in the lobby and sat back down, same row, but the second seat in. So that's where he was arrested. He was sitting in the second seat, but originally was in the fifth seat in.
Right.
And
right. So then at that time, so what happened when they turned up the lights?
They turn up the lights, and all of a sudden Brewer hears somebody banging on the back door, which is right up the stairs behind him next to the stage. So it's locked from the inside. So he goes, and it's a push bar. So he pushes the door, and there's a dozen cops out there, and they grab him, and they throw him up against the wall, and then they're wondering who he is. And he said he was very scared because they thought he's the suspect slipping out the back door.
Well, Brewer.
So Brewer. So he quickly explains, no, the guy's in there. I just saw him because he had just seen him stand up, fifth seat, and sit back down. He's in there. Brown shirt, can you point him out? Yeah. So the cops all go in, they stand behind the curtain, and he points it out. Now, Nick McDonald's the guy he's pointing this out to. So Nick goes up the one aisle. There are three cops shadowing him in the other aisle, and Nick, they frisked a few people on the way up, and then they got up close to him, and Nick said that he was kind of looking at Oswald out of the corner of his eye, but he's kind of looking at this other couple that are sitting across from him. And when he got right, almost like he's going to question this other couple, he spins quickly to Oswald. He notices he's got both hands sitting in his lap. He says, "Get on your feet." Oswald stood up without being asked. Oswald brought his hands up as if surrendering. When they got about shoulder high, Nick starts to reach down like he's going to pat him down. And Oswald suddenly says, "It's all over now." And then he balled up his left hand into a fist, and he slugged McDonald right between the eyes, knocked him down with his right hand, then grabbed for the pistol in his belt. And McDonald saw that, reached up, grabbed the cylinder to keep it from turning, which you're trained to do. And then the cops are all jumping on him, so there's a big struggle. Eyewitnesses and police officers said the gun's waving around. It did snap, according to both theater patrons and police. Nick McDonald always said that the way he had grabbed the cylinder with his left hand, the webbing between his thumb and his index finger was in between the hammer and the firing pin. And so when the hammer came down, that webbing, that flesh dulled the hammer enough to not discharge the round. Now they later said, I think somebody said, well, but we saw a nick on the firing pin. It just didn't go off. And of course, then everybody jumped on that because after the police examined the rounds, nobody could see a nick. There wasn't anything that looked like a firing pin that had hit the round. but I think it was just the snap of the pistol that they heard. And but there's no question that he pulled the gun and attempted to shoot McDonald or anybody else that got in the way.
Sure. So, by the way, according to what they could find when they seized the gun that Oswald had, did it have all the bullets in the chamber? Had he?
Yeah, it was.
How many bullets were in the chamber?
It was fully reloaded, and it had, I believe, it had 3 and 3. So he had 2 different brands of ammunition: Winchester Westerns and Remington Peters. The gun had 3 of each. So 3 Winchester Westerns, 3 Remington Peters, and then in his pocket was another 5 rounds, and I believe they were all Remington Peters.
Right, and so people sometimes will make a big deal about the type of munition used and all that, but
Well, the way they describe it is there was 2 different kinds of bullets that hit Tippit. It's like no, there were 2 different brands of bullets, not 2 different kinds. It was hit with 38 caliber bullets. Now, of course, they couldn't trace the bullets to Oswald's gun like they could the revolver shells conclusively, to the exclusion of all other weapons. And the reason was because he had purchased a World War II vintage Victory model. That what they commonly did, because 38 specials were a better round, they rechambered them. Okay, so to sell these World War II vintage models, they rechambered them and then sold them to the civilian market. So what that did, the rechambering to allow the larger cartridge, is that the diameter of the 38 special bullet is just a smidge smaller than a standard 38 round. So when it went down the barrel, you would get the twist and the grooves on it, 4 lands, right twist or whatever, but it would move erratically. So the little scratches that were in it would be so erratic that even if you fired test rounds in that revolver and tried to compare them to each other, knowing that you had just fired them, you couldn't match them to each other or to the revolver. But the bullets also not only exhibited that particular behavior in terms of scratches, that they had been fired in an undersized barrel, but they also exhibited gas erosion from gases slipping around the bullet because it is undersized. So what's the bottom line? The bottom line is that the bullets could not be traced to Oswald's revolver to the exclusion of all other weapons, but they were fired in a revolver just like Oswald's. A revolver that's firing 38 specials that are undersized in an undersized barrel, and so Oswald's revolver is not excluded from among those that could have fired them. And of course, then you have all the other evidence. You've got the shells that definitely were fired, that witnesses saw him unloading, and 11 witnesses that saw him fleeing the scene. So, and not only that, but then you've got the whole arrest, right?
Sure.
Consciousness of guilt, Oswald's actions, all the suspicious behavior is what really convicts him. And then in addition to all the physical evidence, I don't think there's any question that he would have been convicted in a court of law for the murder of Officer J.D. Tippit.
Well, by the way, you mentioned that the police entered the Texas Theater from 2 directions. Is that right? So that they were entering from the lobby towards the back of the theater, and then by way of the emergency exit that the person from the shoe store had opened up, right? So they poured into the theater from 2 directions. Were they?
That's right.
I'm just wondering. Was there danger that he could have run out of the theater from the?
Oh, I don't think he could have got out of there.
Right, because there were cops. They were just, at the time he was arrested, there were like a couple dozen cops.
They had sealed the front, they'd sealed the back. They were like I say, McDonald originally, accosted him, and then you had there were 3 other cops that were shadowing McDonald coming up the other. One was coming down the aisle that Oswald was in, one was in the aisle behind him, and one was in the aisle in front. And they were approaching as McDonald's ordering him to his feet. So when they grapple for the gun, those 3 cops immediately run in. So you got 4 guys on the scene immediately, and then they're yelling, and then all the other cops that are in the area, somewhere in the balcony, like Paul Bentley, they come running down there. He ends up hurting straining a ligament or something, jumping over one of the seats. But there was a whole bunch of them in the melee. And then one of the things, as soon as they got him subdued, he starts yelling, "Police brutality," and "I'm not resisting arrest." And several of the cops there, in fact, Westbrook later told Larry Sneed, an author, he says, I don't know how there could possibly be any police brutality in a situation like that, where you've got a mad dog killer that just shot a police officer in broad daylight, cold blood.
Yeah.
He says, to him, he says, I can't imagine you not beating the hell out of him. But they didn't do. Everybody said that they didn't do any more. They didn't treat him any more roughly than was needed to affect the arrest. And sometimes guys are, he's struggling, so all right, we're going to hit you a few times.
Sure, I mean, that's just how you subdue a prisoner, subdue a suspect.
Sometimes it has to be done, especially one brandishing
Absolutely.
a weapon.